10 minutes. That's what it takes to get the kids to sleep, right? These later nights of light, definitely make the kids and everyone really want to stay outside. So
sorry we're late for anybody who's not on at the moment.
That's right.
All of our fans.
Yeah. Well, we're on.
We are on. It's somebody else is on. So,
but tonight, partly we didn't want to rush either. This is the end.
Yeah.
This is the end of this book.
Yeah.
It leads on to other good stories. So maybe we'll pick that one up too.
Yeah. At the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, chapter 15.
Chapter 15. And I'll start.
All right.
While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me, and all we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children were, for a few seconds, in a very great danger. For with wild cries and a noise of skirtling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope, right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and thin clouds were passing across her. But still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it. And they cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again. And then again they were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again and kissed it and fondled it and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. It was all the more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cords so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. Go ahead.
Okay. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been, if you've been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now, whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little gray things. "Ugh," said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling over him. Go away, you little beast!" And she raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy, who'd been looking at them more closely still. Can you see what they're doing? Both girls bent down and stared. I do believe, said Susan. How queer, they're nibbling away at the cords. That's what I thought, said Lucy. I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him. It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew, and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk about a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. Then, at last, as they stood for a moment looking out toward the sea in Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment, they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, and for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, cried the girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it more magic? Yes, a great voice behind their backs. Used to be read.
It is more magic. They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan, cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. You're not, asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. Do I look it? He said. Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan, cried Lucy. And both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. It means, said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead. The table would crack, and death itself would start working backward. And now... "Oh, yes, now," said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail, and then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over it to reach him. Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws and catching them again. And now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy would never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan presently, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare to look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. And then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back. And Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them, and then shot off faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that. And then take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse or the soft roughness of golden fur and the mane flying back into the wind. And then imagine you're going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on and on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree and trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smaller streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. And you are riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but right across Narnia. In spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down, down, down again into the wild valleys, and out into acres of blue flowers. I imagine that C.S. Lewis is probably doing that with Jesus at this very moment.
Yeah.
He's like, again? Again, Clive? You want to try that again? Let me see, did I get all that right? Did you go by the beech trees? I mean, you can just imagine that he's fulfilling that.
Yeah.
And C.S. Lewis is just like, this is nothing like I described.
Right, even better. Yeah.
But it is a wonderful description. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle, a little toy castle. It looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on a level with it. And now it no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet toward it. "The witch is home," he cried. Now, children, hold tight. Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. For the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had yet made, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues.
So what happened about the statues? Oh, that's chapter 16. What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All those stone animals and people, too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan's doing something. He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without wasting a moment, he whisked round, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire. And for a second, nothing seems to have happened. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere, the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, ruddy brown of foxes, dogs, and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone. "Look, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of a stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." So good. "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy. But it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later, he lifted the club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off than the top of a haystack and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered that 10 to 1, you would have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. His asides. Now for the inside of this house, said Aslan. Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed. And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out at once, Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stair. Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo. Call Aslan. Phew, how it smells in here. Look out for trapdoors. Up here, there are a whole lot more on the landing. But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs shouting, Aslan, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus. Oh, do come quick. A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing round and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, But how are we going to get out? For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked.
That'll be all right, said Aslan. And then, rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. Hi, you up there, he roared. What's your name? Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please your honor, said the giant, once more touching his cap. Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin, said Aslan, just let us out of this, will you? Certainly, your honor. It will be a pleasure, said Giant Rumblebuffin. Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns. Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them, the sky. Blowed if it all in a muck sweat, said the giant, puffing at the largest railway engine. Comes out of being out of condition. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you. Yes, I have, said Lucy, standing on tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. Thank you, Missy, said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. Next moment, Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught up in midair between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, Bless me, I picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, Missy. I thought you was the handkerchief. No, no, said Lucy, laughing. Here it is. This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him that a saccharin tablet would be to you, so that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his great red face, she said, I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin. Not at all, said the giant politely. Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it. What a nice giant he is, said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. Oh, yes, replied the fawn. All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was. But an old family with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone. At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. Our day's work is not yet over, he said, and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once. And join in, I hope, sir, added the largest of centaurs. Of course, said Aslan. And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarves, small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can. That is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves. And with a great deal of bustle and cheering, they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions.
Mhm.
That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me." At least he went on saying this till Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him.
I don't think he said us lions, did he?
Yeah, up front with us lions.
Okay.
Of course, says Aslan. Let's see. On the backs of those who can. Those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle
With
is.
us lions to smell out the battle. Yeah. Okay. That's funny. Which one of us is going to be seated beside you, Jesus?
Yeah. Well, us lions, you hear? He doesn't have any pretense. He's us lions. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted into their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions. But then, suddenly, one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon, all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others, streaked out for about half mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better because every now and then, with the music of the hounds, was mixed with the roar of the other lion, and sometimes far deeper in the more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks, and of the clashing of metal against metal.
Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now in the daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few. And there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. But she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side, the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then, with a roar that shook all Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted toward him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. The lion and witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath. And at that same moment, all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines, dwarfs with their battle axes, dogs with teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hoofs. And Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemies squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. So Lucy saw her face lifted toward him. Oh, the white witch.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Just
Her
for a
face.
moment as he came, you know,
Yeah.
had to be bewildering,
Yeah.
you know.
The two swords looked like three swords.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, the last chapter.
The hunting of the white stag.
The battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions. And when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took to flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to her to see Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan, Peter was saying. We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had sense to bring his sword smashing down her wand, instead of trying to go for her directly and simply getting made a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have some chance, if we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him. They found Edmund in charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood. His mouth was open and his face a nasty green color. Quick, Lucy, said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. There are other people wounded, said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. Yes, I know, said Lucy crossly. Wait a minute. Daughter of Eve, said Aslan in a graver voice. Others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund? I'm sorry, Aslan, said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded while he restored those who had been turned into stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had seen him look, for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, which is where he had begun to go wrong, he had become his real old self again, and could look you in the face. And there on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. Does he know, whispered Lucy to Susan, what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was? Hush. Of course not, said Susan. Oughtn't he to be told, said Lucy. Oh, surely not, said Susan. It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if you were he. Think about how that would feel.
Oof.
Whew. All the same, I think he ought to know, said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them, I don't know. For them all, I don't know. But somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down in the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. Next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river. And the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And the cry of the seagulls. Have you heard it? Can you remember? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But next day was more solemn. For then, in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock's feathers, and the eastern door which looks toward the sea, and the presence of all their friends, and to the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the four thrones amid deafening shouts of, "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always the king or queen. Bear it well, sons of Adam. Bear it well, daughters of Eve, said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and giant Rumblebuffin, to the leopards, and the great centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast and caravel, and revelry, and dancing, and gold flashed, and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. You want to pick up?
But amid all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away. And when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down. And of course, he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. He's not a tame lion." And now, as you see, this story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These two kings and two queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time, there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting here and a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf one month and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out, and they made good laws and kept the peace and saved good trees from becoming unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarves and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort from giant Rumblebuffin, on the north of Narnia, and these ventured across the frontier, and they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them. And Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman, with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. And she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged fawn by now and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts, the white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these two kings and two queens and the principal members of their court rode a-hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they had a sight of him, and he led them a great pace over rough and smooth and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and only these four were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, for they talked quite a different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I never hunted a nobler quarry." Sir, said the others, even so, let us do. So they alighted and tied their horses to trees and went on into the thick wood on foot. And as soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron. Madam, said King Edmund, if you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron with a lantern set on the top thereof. By the lion's mane, a strange device, said King Peter, to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it that if it were lit, it should just give light to no man. Sir, said Queen Lucy, by likelihood when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees in the place, or fewer, or none. For this is a young wood, and the iron post is old. They stood looking upon it. And then said King Edmund, I know not how it is, but this lamp on this post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like before, as if it were a dream, or in the dream of a dream. Sir, answered they all, it is even so with us also. And more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, or else some great change of our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like foreboding stirreth in my heart also. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. And in mine too, said Queen Susan. Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses, and follow this white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee have me excused. For never since we were 4 kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matter, as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over. But always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me that we should be shamed if for any fearing or foreboding we turn back from following such a noble beast as now we have in this chase. And so say I, said King Edmund, and I have such desire to find the signification of this thing that I would not by my good will turn back for the richest jewel in all Narnia and all the islands. Then in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if ye will all have it so, let us go on and take the adventure that shall fall to us. It's interesting what he's getting at, I guess. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, they're speaking like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That they have become king. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
After you.
All right, almost there. So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamppost. And before they had gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And next moment, they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into the empty room. And they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they never came into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believe the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route, nor would the coats be much use by now if you did. What's that? Yes, of course he'll get back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else unless you find that they've had adventures of the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know, all right. Odd things they say, even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia.
That's the end
Of this story.
of this story.
For this part, yes.
What a treat.
Yeah, such a treat. I wish we could chat.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you, Peggy.
We've enjoyed being read to as well.
Yeah. Thank y'all. It's been a good time for us, and it's helpful to have the motivation to be here and to know there's a few more joining in. So
we'll pick it up somehow. Think of another book and try and let everybody know and see what happens.
Yeah. If y'all
Thanks.
want to shoot anything our way, we're willing to listen. But
we'll keep it up. Maybe we'll keep it up. Maybe they'll let this Zoom call thing, or I don't know. We'll figure out something.
Yeah.
We can record. But thanks for joining. Have a great Easter week. It is a great week to end on that story. We didn't plan that. It did end that way. It's
good to have stories of hope.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Think about our only hope.
Yes.
In Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and how well he writes of it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you. Peace.